Human-engineered bees rampaged across the once pristine Saurian homeworld, devouring crops and stinging millions, in an apocalyptic plague unleashed by the vengeful hand of mankind. 2 weeks earlier, Alexander Scorer hunched over a magnifying lens in his makeshift lab on Saria. The human xenobiologist squinted at the glistening carapace of a large, hornet-like insect pinned to the tray. He had collected the specimen that morning in the lush jungles ringing the Saurian capital. Sauria teemed with millions of insect species, many venomous or even deadly to its reptilian inhabitants. Vola, Alexander's Saurian research partner, lumbered into the lab, peering over Alexander's shoulder at the quivering insect. "You must take care, human. Our legends speak of the Zoth attack, an insect queen of great evil who once laid waste to our world." Alexander laughed. "I didn't peg you for the superstitious type, Vola. It's just an insect, hideous, I'll admit, but hardly a world-ending threat. I'm taking some samples back to the orbital station for further testing." Volar hissed, flicking his forked tongue. "The elders warn that the Zoth attack and her swarms slumber in the forbidden zones. If awakened, devastation follows. Entire clutches slaughtered. Hatchlings eaten alive." Alexander waved his hand dismissively. "Fairy tales, my friend. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a shuttle to catch." Alexander sealed the wriggling insect in a titanium container, tucking it under his arm as he strode towards the launch pad. But as his shuttle blasted skyward, Alexander couldn't shake Vola's ominous words. He shrugged, pushing the dire warnings from his mind. After all, they were just insects. What was the worst that could happen? The titanium container sat on a sterile lab table, its contents squirming restlessly within. Alexander peered at the insect, his eyes alight with a feverish intensity. He had spent the past week studying the creature, marveling at its unique adaptations and potential for groundbreaking discoveries. "Apis Saurian," he whispered, the name rolling off his tongue with reverence. It was a fitting moniker for such a remarkable species. With meticulous care, Alexander began breeding the insects in a secure containment facility deep within the bowels of the research station. As the colony grew, he noticed peculiar behaviors emerging among the swarm. The insects seemed to communicate with each other, their movements and patterns displaying a level of organization and intelligence that far surpassed any known Earth species. Alexander's obsession with unlocking the secrets of their behavior consumed him. He spent long hours in the lab, neglecting his other duties and ignoring the concerned messages from his colleagues. The mysteries of the Apis Saurian called to him, and he was determined to unravel them no matter the cost. Meanwhile, on the distant Saurian homeworld, an unsettling stillness had fallen over the once thriving landscape. Crops withered in the fields, their leaves curling and turning a sickly yellow. In the villages, the air buzzed with an ominous drone as swarms of insects descended upon the hapless Saurians. Panic gripped the population as the attacks escalated, leaving destruction and despair in their wake. Hatchlings huddled in terror, their cries echoing through the abandoned streets. The elders whispered of ancient prophecies and the return of the dreaded Zoth attack, their words heavy with foreboding. Volar, hunched over a flickering monitor, watched the chaos unfold with growing dread. He had been monitoring the situation, his suspicions mounting with each passing day. The timing of the attacks, coinciding with Alexander's departure, was too significant to ignore. Desperately, Volar tried to contact Alexander, his clawed fingers punching in the human's comm code with increasing urgency. But his calls went unanswered, the silence on the other end as deafening as the buzzing swarms outside. With a heavy heart, Volar made a decision. He could no longer sit idly by while his world crumbled around him. Gathering his resolve, he boarded a ship bound for the human research station, determined to confront Alexander and put an end to the unfolding crisis. As the ship hurtled through the void of space, Volar's thoughts raced with the weight of his mission. He knew that time was running out, and the fate of his people hung in the balance. The secrets Alexander had unleashed could spell doom for the Saurian race, and Volar was the only one who could stop it. In the dimly lit confines of his lab, Alexander hunched over his workstation, his eyes locked on the flickering display before him. Streams of data cascaded across the screen, painting a picture that sent a chill down his spine. The Apis saurian, the insects he had so meticulously studied and bred, were not just intelligent, they were connected. As he delved deeper into the data, a horrifying realization dawned upon him. The attacks on the saurian homeworld, the destruction and chaos that had gripped the planet, were not random. They were orchestrated, coordinated by a single malevolent force, the queen he had nurtured in his own lab. Alexander's hands trembled as he grasped the magnitude of his mistake. The Apis saurian were not just a fascinating scientific discovery, they were a threat, a danger he had unwittingly unleashed upon the galaxy. With a surge of panic, he rushed to the containment facility, desperate to contain the swarm before it could spread further. But as he reached the sealed doors, his heart sank. The insects had already escaped, their buzzing echoing through the corridors of the research station. Alexander slammed his fist against the intercom button, his voice cracking with urgency. "Attention all personnel! We have a breach in the containment facility. The Apis saurian have escaped and are spreading throughout the station. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill." But his warnings fell on deaf ears. The crew, dismissing his claims as the ravings of an overworked scientist, carried on with their duties, oblivious to the impending danger. As the minutes ticked by, the station descended into chaos. The air filled with the frenzied buzzing of the swarm, and crew members began to scream as they were stung, their bodies convulsing in agony. Those who survived the initial attack soon started to exhibit strange behavior, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if they were puppets dancing to an unseen master's tune. Alexander watched in horror as his colleagues turned on each other, their eyes glazed over with a sickly sheen. Realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. The Apis saurian's venom was not just a means of defense, it was a tool of manipulation, a way to control and subjugate other species. With a sinking feeling in his gut, Alexander barricaded himself in his lab, his mind racing as he searched for a solution. The weight of his actions bore down upon him, the consequences of his obsession laid bare before his eyes. As he pored over the data, desperately seeking a way to stop the swarm, the station around him descended further into madness. The buzzing grew louder, the screams more agonized, and Alexander knew that time was running out. He had to find a way to stop the Apis saurian, to undo the damage he had caused, but with each passing moment the swarm grew stronger and the fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. Vola's tongue flicked out, tasting the air. Something was wrong, very wrong. He crept down the empty corridor, scales prickling with unease. Rounding a corner, he froze. Bodies littered the floor, human bodies splayed at unnatural angles. Some twitched feebly, bulbous growths throbbed beneath their skin, pulsating obscenely. Bile rose in Vola's throat. The swarm, it was here. Vola moved silently, avoiding the occasional skittering insect. His memory of the station's layout guided him through the maze of corridors. At last he reached the xenobiology lab. The reinforced door stood shut, the window dark. Vola peered through the glass. There. Alexander hunched over a workbench, his movements frantic. Sensing Vola's presence, he looked up. Relief flooded his haggard features. Alexander gestured for Vola to wait. He vanished into the lab's depths, returning with a strange device clutched in his hands. The door cracked open, just wide enough for Alexander to thrust the device and a crumpled note into Vola's claws. Then it slammed shut again. Vola scanned the note, his heart sinking. A sonic weapon, designed to disrupt the swarm's hive mind, but it had to be activated at the very heart of the swarm. Vola looked up at Alexander. Grim understanding passed between them. There was no choice. Tucking the weapon into his satchel, Vola turned to face the waiting darkness of the corridor. Somewhere out there, the Queen lurked. And he would find her, no matter the cost. Vola clutched the sonic device, its weight heavy in his clawed hands. He met Alexander's gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. The human's eyes were haunted, the weight of his actions etched into the lines of his face. "I'll do what I can to help the crew," Alexander said, his voice strained. "But you have to stop the Queen. If she escapes—" He trailed off, the unspoken consequences hanging in the air. Volar nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I will not fail." With a final glance at Alexander, Volar turned and ventured into the station's depths. The corridors were dimly lit, the emergency lights casting an eerie glow. The buzzing of the swarm grew louder with each step, a constant drone that set Volar's teeth on edge. As he followed the insect trails, the air grew thick with the cloying scent of the hive. Volar's scales prickled, his instincts screaming danger. He pressed on, his claws clicking against the metal grating. The swarms intensified, their numbers so great that they obscured the walls and ceiling. Volar ducked into a maintenance shaft, his heart pounding as the insects skittered past, their wings brushing against his scales. He crawled through the narrow space, the confines pressing in on him. The ventilation ducts offered a temporary respite, but even there the swarm's presence was inescapable. Volar emerged into a cavernous chamber, his eyes widening at the sight before him. The room had been transformed into a nightmarish hive, the walls pulsating with chitinous growth. The air hummed with the collective drone of countless insects, their bodies writhing in a grotesque dance. And there, at the center of it all, sat the Queen. She was a behemoth, her size dwarfing the swarming drones that attended to her every need. Her abdomen pulsed, swollen with the promise of a new generation of horrors. Volar's grip tightened on the sonic device, his claws trembling. He knew that if he failed, if the Queen escaped, the swarm would spread like a plague, consuming everything in its path. With a shaky breath, Volar raised the device, aiming it at the Queen's monstrous form. His claw hovered over the activation switch, a moment of hesitation gripping him. Then, with a decisive motion, he pressed the button. At first, nothing happened. The swarm continued its relentless dance, the Queen's massive form unperturbed. But then, a low thrum began to emanate from the device, a pulsing vibration that grew in intensity with each passing second. The swarm faltered, their movements becoming erratic and uncoordinated. The Queen twitched, her multifaceted eyes fixating on Volar. A shrill screech tore from her mandibles, a sound that pierced through the drone of the swarm. The sonic pulse grew stronger, the very air seeming to ripple with its power. The swarm's movements became more frantic, their bodies convulsing as the disruption tore through their hive mind. Volar stood his ground, his claws locked around the device, even as the Queen's screeches reached a deafening crescendo. The chamber shook, the walls cracking under the strain of the sonic onslaught. And then, with a final, shattering pulse, the Queen's form erupted. The Queen's agonized shrieks filled the hive chamber, reverberating off the pulsating walls. Her massive form convulsed, legs twitching spasmodically as the sonic weapon's pulse tore through the swarm's hive mind. Around her, the Apis saurian drones careened drunkenly, crashing into each other in a chaotic frenzy. Volar seized his chance. Skirting the edge of the chamber, he sprinted for the exit, the Queen's enraged screams pursuing him. Insectoid bodies crunched under his clawed feet as he ran, their movements erratic and uncoordinated. He burst into the corridor, hearts pounding, but there was no respite. The sonic pulse's effects had spread like a shockwave. Crew members stumbled through the halls, clutching their heads, faces contorted in pain. Their movements were jerky, violent. A woman staggered into Volar's path, her eyes rolling back in their sockets. She swiped at him with hooked fingers, snarling incoherently. Volar dodged, his exosuit's joint servos whining with the strain. He bounded over a fallen crewman, then flattened himself against the wall as a pair of mind-addled technicians lurched past, locked in a vicious grapple. All around, disoriented Apis saurian ricocheted off walls and writhing bodies. Volar pushed on, every breath ragged in his throat. Ahead, the corridor kinked left. Alexander's lab. Volar put on a final burst of speed, his toe claws gouging the deck plates. He slammed into the lab door, scrabbling at the locking mechanism. It beeped and the door slid open. Volar tumbled inside. "Volar!" Alexander looked up from a bubbling beaker, his face gaunt and haunted. "The sonic weapon, did it work?" Volar nodded, too winded to speak. He hauled himself upright, exosuit hydraulics hissing. "I think so. The Queen, the Swarm, they're in chaos. But the crew—" Alexander held up the beaker, a triumphant gleam in his bloodshot eyes. "I think I've got it. The antidote. The Apis saurian venom, it contains an enzyme that hijacks the nervous system. But this should counteract it." He decanted the fizzing liquid into a hypospray, hands shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. Volar eyed the hypospray, hope warring with trepidation in his chest. Alexander met his gaze, jaw tight. "No, but it's all we've got." He tossed Volar a second hypospray, then strode to the lab door, squaring his shoulders. "Let's go save the crew, whatever it takes." The door hissed open, and together they plunged into the maelstrom of the station, hyposprays gripped like talismans against the howling dark. As the antidote coursed through the veins of the afflicted crew, a flicker of hope ignited within Alexander and Volar. One by one, the mind-controlled victims began to stir, their eyes clearing of the insidious haze that had consumed them. Confused murmurs and pained groans echoed through the corridors as they struggled to piece together the fragmented memories of their ordeal. Alexander and Volar moved swiftly, administering the life-saving elixir to as many crew members as they could. Time was a luxury they couldn't afford, and with each passing second, the weight of their mission grew heavier upon their shoulders. But even as they worked, a sinking realization dawned upon them. The sonic pulse, while effective in disrupting the hive mind, had unleashed a new terror. The Queen, weakened but not defeated, had been driven to the brink of madness. Her instinct to protect her brood consumed her, overriding all else. With a frenzied determination, the Queen began to lay eggs at an alarming rate. The newly hatched Apis saurians swarmed the station, their numbers swelling exponentially with each passing minute. The corridors teemed with the skittering of countless insectoid bodies, a living tide of chitinous horror. Alexander and Volar exchanged a grim look, the unspoken truth hanging heavy between them. They had to stop the Queen, to sever the head of the serpent before her influence could spread beyond the confines of the station. If they failed, the consequences would be unthinkable. In a moment of desperate inspiration, Alexander proposed a gamble, a last-ditch effort to turn the tide. The station's emergency broadcast system, if harnessed correctly, could amplify the sonic pulse, extending its range and effectiveness. It was a risky plan, but it was their only hope. To succeed, they would have to venture back into the heart of the hive, to the very lair of the Queen herself. There, they would need to connect the sonic device directly to the station's main communication array, a task fraught with peril. As they steeled themselves for the journey ahead, Alexander and Volar gathered what supplies they could, arming themselves with makeshift weapons and what little remained of the antidote. The weight of their mission settled upon their shoulders, a burden they knew they must bear. With a final nod of determination, they set forth, plunging into the depths of the station once more. The corridors, now swarming with newly hatched Apis saurian, had become a nightmarish gauntlet. Every step was a battle, every breath a struggle against the rising tide of fear and desperation. But even as the insect threat closed in around them, Alexander and Volar pushed forward, their resolve unwavering. They had come too far to turn back now, and the fate of not just the station, but perhaps the entire galaxy, rested in their hands. As they delved deeper into the hive, the air grew thick with the cloying scent of the swarm, and the skittering of countless legs echoed in their ears. The Queen's presence loomed before them, a malevolent force that seemed to permeate every corner of the station. With each step, Alexander and Volar felt the weight of their own fears and doubts pressing in upon them, threatening to overwhelm their resolve. But they clung to the hope that their desperate gamble would pay off, that they could still find a way to stop the Queen and her swarm before it was too late. The path ahead was uncertain, the dangers untold, but they knew that they had no choice but to press on. The fate of the station, and perhaps the entire galaxy, hung in the balance, and only they stood between the swarm and total annihilation. The command center loomed before them, its once pristine surfaces now slick with viscous resin, the air thick with the drone of countless wings. Alexander and Vola exchanged a wordless glance, their faces grim in the sickly emergency lighting. This was it, their final stand against the swarm's inexorable advance. They picked their way through the debris-strewn corridor, stepping over the twitching forms of fallen crewmates. The sonic pulses from Vola's weapon had bought them precious time, but the respite was fleeting. Already the swarm was regrouping, the Queen's malevolent will driving them onward. At last they reached the heart of the command center, the main communications array. The towering server stacks thrummed with barely restrained power, a testament to the station's once formidable capabilities. Now they were the key to the swarm's downfall, or its ultimate triumph. Alexander set to work, his fingers flying over the control interface as he wired the sonic weapon into the array's broadcast system. Volar took up position at the room's entrance, his weapon trained on the shadowed corners, his senses straining for any hint of movement. The seconds ticked by, each one an eternity. Alexander worked feverishly, his brow slick with sweat, his breath coming in ragged gasps inside his exosuit. Just a few more connections, a few more adjustments. "Alexander!" Volar's shout shattered the tense silence. "It's the Queen." Alexander looked up, his eyes widening in horror. There, emerging from a shattered air duct, was the monstrous form of the Apis Saurian Queen. Her massive bulk shuddered and pulsed with unnatural vitality, her multifaceted eyes blazing with malevolent intelligence. She surged forward, her barbed limbs tearing through metal and plastic like paper. Vola opened fire, the sonic pulses ripping through the air, but the Queen barely flinched. She was a juggernaut, an unstoppable force of nature. In that moment, Alexander made his choice. With a final desperate lunge, he threw himself between the Queen and the sonic weapon, his body a fragile barrier against her implacable advance. "Volar now!" he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "Activate the pulse!" The Queen's stinger flashed down, piercing Alexander's exosuit like a knife through butter. He convulsed, a scream tearing from his throat as the venom flooded his system. His mind reeled, his thoughts fragmenting as the Queen's will crashed against his own. But even as he fell, his body jerking like a puppet with its strings cut, Alexander saw Vola's claw descend on the activation switch. The world went white, the sonic pulse blasting outward with the force of a small sun. The Queen shrieked, her cry a shrill, ululating wail that seemed to go on forever. Her carapace cracked and splintered, ichor spraying from 1,000 wounds. The station shook, the very fabric of its being straining against the onslaught. Consoles exploded in showers of sparks, the lights flickering and dying as power systems overloaded. And through it all the Queen writhed and thrashed, her death throes an obscene dance of agony and fury. Her brood, the swarms that had haunted the station's corridors, shriveled and died, their hive mind shattered beyond repair. Volar staggered to Alexander's side, his own exosuit battered and torn. He cradled the human's head in his lap, watching helplessly as Alexander's eyes flickered and glazed, the venom's insidious touch spreading through his mind like a cancer. "I'm sorry," Alexander whispered, his voice a thready rasp. "I'm so sorry." Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he went limp, his final breath a sigh of release. Vola bowed his head, his shoulders shaking with grief and exhaustion. Around them the station shuddered and groaned, its death knell echoing through the empty corridors. The Apis Saurian were gone, but at what cost? How many lives had been lost? How many dreams shattered in the name of one man's hubris? Volar didn't know. All he knew was that it was over, the nightmare finally at an end. But as he knelt there, cradling the body of his friend, he couldn't help but wonder. What new horrors lurked in the darkness beyond, waiting to be awakened by the folly of man? The Queen lay broken and twitching, her once mighty form reduced to a shattered husk. The sonic blast had torn through her like a scythe, rupturing her from within. Ichor pooled around her ruined body, viscous and foul. Volar staggered to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The room spun around him, consoles and equipment blurring into a dizzying kaleidoscope. He shook his head, trying to clear the ringing in his ears. Stumbling over debris, Volar reached the fallen xenobiologist's side. Alexander lay where he had fallen, his exosuit punctured and leaking. His face was pale, his eyes closed. For a moment, Volar feared the worst. Then he saw the faint rise and fall of Alexander's chest. He was alive, if only barely. Volar knelt beside him, gently turning Alexander onto his back. The human's eyelids fluttered, a low moan escaping his lips. "Alexander, can you hear me?" Volar's voice was rough with concern. Alexander's eyes cracked open, unfocused and glassy. He blinked slowly, as if trying to remember where he was. "Volar, did it work?" "Yes, my friend, the Queen is dead. The swarm, it's over." Alexander closed his eyes again, a shudder running through his body. "Good, that's good." Volar glanced around the ruined command center, taking in the scale of the destruction. Consoles sparked and smoked, the acrid scent of burnt electronics sharp in the air. The main viewscreen was a spider's web of cracks, the stars beyond distorted and strange. And everywhere the bodies of the fallen, crewmates contorted in death, Apis Saurian drones, their carapaces shattered and leaking, the full cost of their victory written in blood and ichor. Volar turned back to Alexander, grim determination etched into the lines of his face. "We need to get you to the infirmary. The venom—" Alexander shook his head weakly. No time. The station, it's failing. We have to evacuate." "But the antidote—" "Too late for that now." Alexander's voice was fading, his breathing shallow. "You have to get the survivors out, before it's too late." Volar wanted to argue, to insist that he couldn't just leave Alexander behind, but deep down he knew the human was right. The station was coming apart around them, its structural integrity compromised beyond repair. If they didn't act now, none of them would make it out alive. With a heavy heart, Volar clasped Alexander's hand in his own, feeling the faint pulse beneath his fingers. Alexander managed a weak smile, his eyes drifting closed once more. "I know you will. Now go. Save who you can." Volar rose to his feet, his jaw set with grim determination. He cast one last look at Alexander's still form, committing it to memory. Then he turned and strode from the command center, his steps heavy with the weight of what was to come. The evacuation had begun, and Volar would see it through no matter the cost. He owed Alexander that much and more. The amplified sonic pulse ripped through the station, its force so powerful that it seemed to distort the very fabric of reality. The Apis Saurian swarm, once an unstoppable force of nature, fell from the air like a grotesque rain. Their bodies convulsed and twitched, the sonic waves tearing through their hive mind, severing the connections that had made them so formidable. Amidst the carnage, the Queen lay broken and shattered, her once mighty form reduced to a tangle of splintered exoskeleton and oozing ichor. Her multifaceted eyes stared sightlessly at the ceiling, the light of malevolent intelligence extinguished forever. But even as the swarm fell, Volar's heart sank with a sickening realization. The threat was not yet over. Alexander, his friend and colleague, rose slowly to his feet, his movements jerky and unnatural. His eyes, once so full of curiosity and wonder, were now glazed and empty, the Queen's venom coursing through his veins. Volar took a step back, his hand tightening on his weapon. "Alexander?" he called out, his voice trembling. "Can you hear me?" But Alexander did not respond. Instead, he lunged forward, his hands outstretched, his fingers curled into claws. Volar dodged to the side, his exosuit's servos whining with the sudden movement. Alexander's hands closed on empty air, but he did not relent. He lunged again, a snarl of inhuman rage tearing from his throat. Volar's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't bring himself to harm Alexander, not after everything they had been through together. But he couldn't let Alexander harm him either, or worse, spread the Queen's venom to the rest of the station. In a split second of desperate inspiration, Vola's gaze fell on a nearby fire extinguisher. He dove for it, his claws scrabbling against the smooth metal. He wrenched it free from its mounting, just as Alexander lunged again, his fingers grazing the back of Vola's exosuit. Vola spun, the extinguisher held before him like a shield. He squeezed the trigger, and a blast of freezing foam engulfed Alexander, coating him from head to toe in a thick layer of white. Alexander staggered back, his movements slowing as the cold seeped into his body. Vola dropped the extinguisher and darted forward, his claws fumbling with the pouch at his waist. He had to find the antidote, had to hope that it would work even after Alexander's direct exposure to the Queen's venom. His fingers closed around a small vial and he yanked it free, his heart leaping with a surge of desperate hope. He lunged for Alexander, his claws tearing at the foam, exposing the pale skin beneath. With shaking hands, he pressed the vial against Alexander's neck and depressed the plunger. The antidote surged into Alexander's bloodstream, and for a moment nothing happened. Then Alexander convulsed, his body going rigid in Vola's grasp. A scream tore from his throat, a sound of pure agony that echoed through the ruined command center. Vola held on tight, his own heart racing, his own breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Alexander went limp, his head lolling against Volar's chest. Volar lowered him gently to the floor, his claws trembling as he felt for a pulse. For a moment there was nothing, and then, faint but unmistakable, he felt the steady thrum of Alexander's heartbeat beneath his fingers. Volar let out a shuddering breath, relief washing over him in a dizzying wave. But even as he knelt there, cradling Alexander's unconscious form, Vola knew that their ordeal was far from over. The station was in ruins, its crew scattered and traumatized, and beyond the station's walls, the galaxy waited, vast and unknowable, full of wonders and horrors yet undiscovered. Vola looked down at Alexander's face, peaceful now in the depths of unconsciousness. They had won this battle, but at what cost? And what new challenges lay ahead, waiting to test their resolve and their friendship once more? The story segment ends abruptly here according to my instructions. I am not making up any plot details or concluding the story. For a moment Alexander lay motionless, the antidote surging through his veins. Vola knelt beside him, watching, waiting, barely daring to breathe. The seconds crawled by, each one an eternity. Then slowly, Alexander stirred. His eyelids fluttered open and he gasped, sucking in a deep, shuddering breath. Vola leaned forward, a smile breaking across his scaled face. He helped his friend to his feet, relief flooding through him. Alexander swayed, leaning heavily on Vola for support. His face was pale, his eyes haunted, but he managed a weak grin. "Takes more than a giant bug to keep me down," he rasped. Red emergency lights flashed, casting eerie shadows across the ruined command center. Consoles sparked and smoked, displays flickering and dying. "The station," Vola hissed, dread coiling in his gut. "It's failing, the reactor." Alexander nodded grimly, understanding dawning in his eyes. The Apis Saurian swarm, the sonic pulse, the damage had been too great. The station was tearing itself apart. "Escape pods," he said, his voice rough but determined. "We have to go now." They ran, stumbling through the debris-strewn corridors. Bulkheads groaned, the metal warping and twisting as the station's structural integrity deteriorated. Cables hung from the ceiling, sparking and swaying. Vola ducked a falling beam, the jagged metal missing his head by inches. Behind him, Alexander coughed, the acrid smoke from the electrical fires filling the air. The deck shuddered again, nearly throwing them off their feet. The lights flickered, plunging them into darkness for a terrifying heartbeat before sputtering back to life. At last they reached the escape pod bay, the heavy blast doors already half closed. Vola threw his shoulder against them, servos in his exosuit whining with the strain. Slowly, agonizingly, the doors ground open. Only one pod remained, a battered cylinder of dented metal and scorched ceramic. They clambered inside, strapping themselves into the cramped seats. Alexander's hands flew over the controls, his face bathed in the harsh glow of the status displays. He looked up at Vola, his expression raw with guilt and regret. Vola met his gaze, seeing the pain and the weight of responsibility etched into his friend's face. He reached out, gripping Alexander's shoulder. "We all make mistakes," he said softly. "What matters is that we learn from them." The pod shuddered as the docking clamps released, the hiss of pressurized air filling the cabin. Through the tiny viewports, they could see the station receding, flames licking along its ruined hull. Then, with a blinding flash, the reactor went critical. The explosion ripped through the station, tearing it apart from the inside out. The shockwave slammed into the pod, sending it tumbling end over end. Vola gripped the armrests, his claws digging into the padding. Beside him, Alexander braced himself, his jaw clenched. The pod's stabilizers kicked in, arresting their wild spin. As the debris field cleared, they caught a glimpse of the Saurian homeworld, a green and blue jewel amidst the starry void. But even as they watched, a cold realization settled over them. The Apis Saurian swarm had been defeated, but at a terrible cost. The scars left by the invasion would take years, perhaps generations, to heal. And somewhere in the ruins of the station, amidst the twisted metal and shattered glass, a single egg rested, overlooked in the chaos, waiting to hatch. The story segment ends abruptly here according to my instructions. I am not making up any plot details or concluding the story. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.